Chapter 2, Part 1 of The Uttermost Farthing. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The Uttermost Farthing by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 2, Number 1, Part 1. It was more than a week after the funeral of my poor friend Humphrey Challoner that I paid my first regular visit of inspection to his house. I had been the only intimate friend of this lonely, self-contained man, and he had made me not only his sole executor but his principal legatee. With the exception of a sum of money to endow an Institute of Criminal Anthropology, he had made me the heir to his entire estate, including his museum. The latter bequest was unencumbered by any conditions. I could keep the collection intact, I could sell it as it stood, or I could break it up and distribute the specimens as I chose. But I knew that Challoner's unexpressed wish was that it should be kept together, ultimately to form the nucleus of a collection attached to the Institute. It was a grey autumn afternoon when I let myself in. A caretaker was in charge of the house, which was otherwise unoccupied, and the museum, which was in a separate wing, seemed strangely silent and remote. As the Yale latch of the massive door clicked behind me, I seemed to be, and in fact was, cut off from all the world. A mysterious, sepulchral stillness pervaded the place, and when I entered the long room I found myself unconsciously treading lightly so as not to disturb the silence, even as one might on entering some Egyptian tomb chamber hidden in the heart of a pyramid. I halted in the center of the long room and looked about me, and I don't mind confessing that I felt distinctly creepy. It was not the skeleton of the whale that hung overhead, with its ample but ungenial smile. It was not the bandy-legged skeleton of the rachitic camel, nor of the aurochs, nor those of the apes and jackals and porcupines in the smaller glass case, nor the skulls that grinned from the case at the end of the room. It was the long row of human skeletons, each erect and watchful on its little pedestal that occupied the great wall case, a silent, motionless company of fleshless sentinels, standing in easy postures with unchanging, mirthless grins, and seeming to wait for something. That was what disturbed me. I am not an impressionable man, and, as a medical practitioner, it is needless to say that mere bones have no terrors for me. A skeleton from which I worked as a student was kept in my bedroom, and I minded it no more than I minded the plates in Gray's Anatomy. I could have slept comfortably in the Hunterian Museum, other circumstances being favorable, and even the gigantic skeleton of Corporal O'Brien, which graces that collection, with that of his companion, the quaint little dwarf, thrown in, would not have disturbed my rest in the smallest degree. But this was different. I had the feeling, as I had had before, that there was something queer about this museum of Challoner's. I walked slowly along the great wall case, looking in at the specimens, and in the dull light each seemed to look out at me as I passed with a questioning expression in his shadowy eye sockets, as if he would ask, "Do you know who I was?" It made me quite uncomfortable. There were 25 of them in all. Each stood on a small black pedestal on which was painted in white a number and a date, excepting one at the end, which had a scarlet pedestal and gold lettering. Number 1 bore the date 20th September, 1889, and number 25, the one with the red pedestal, was dated 13th May, 1909. I looked at this last one curiously, a massive figure with traces of great muscularity, a broad, mongoloid head with large cheekbones and square eye sockets. A formidable fellow he must have been, and even now the broad square face grinned out savagely from the case. I turned away with something of a shudder. I had not come here to get the creeps. I had come for Challoner's journal, or the museum archives, as he called it. The volumes were in the secret cupboard at the end of the room, and I had to take out the movable panel to get at them. This presented no difficulty. I found the rosettes that moved the catches, and had the panel out in a twinkling. The cupboard was 5 feet high by 4 broad, and had a well in the bottom covered by a lid, which I lifted and, to my amazement, found the cavity filled with revolvers, automatic pistols, life-preservers, knuckle-dusters, and other weapons, each having a little label, bearing a number and a date, tied neatly on it. I shut the lid down rather hastily. There was something rather sinister in that collection of lethal appliances. The volumes, 7 in number, were on the top shelf, uniformly bound in Russia leather and labelled respectively Photographs, Fingerprints, Catalogue, and the 4 volumes of Museum Archives. I was about to reach down the catalogue when my eye fell on the pile of shallow boxes on the next shelf. I knew what they contained and recalled uncomfortably the strange impression that their contents had made on me, and yet a sort of fascination led me to take down the top one labeled Series B5 and raise the lid. But if those dreadful dolls' heads had struck me as uncanny when poor Challoner showed them to me, they now seemed positively appalling. Small as they were, and they were not as large as a woman's fist, they looked so lifelike, or rather so deathlike, that they suggested nothing so much as actual human heads seen through the wrong end of a telescope. There were 5 in this box, each in a separate compartment lined with black velvet and distinguished by a black label with white lettering, excepting the central one, which rested on scarlet velvet and had a red label inscribed in gold, 13 May, 1909. I gazed at this tiny head in its scarlet setting with shuddering fascination. It had a hideous little face, a broad, brutal face of the Tartar type, and the mop of grey-brown hair, so unhuman in colour, and the bristling moustache that stood up like cat's whiskers, give it an aspect half animal, half devilish. I clapped the lid on the box, thrust it back on the shelf, and, plucking down the first volume of the Archives, hurried out of the museum. That night, when I had rounded up the day's work with a good dinner, I retired to my study and, drawing up an armchair to the fire, opened the volume. It was a strange document. At first I was unable to perceive the relevancy of the matter to the title, for it seemed to be a journal of Challoner's private life. But later I began to see the connection, to realize, as Challoner had said, that the collection was nothing more than a visible commentary on and illustration of his daily activities. The volume opened with an account of the murder of his wife and the circumstances leading up to it, written with dry circumstantiality that was to me infinitely pathetic. It was the forced impassiveness of a strong man whose heart is breaking. There were no comments, no exclamations, merely a formal recital of facts, exhaustive, literal and precise. I need not quote it, as it only repeated the story he had told me, but I will commence my extract at the point where he broke off. The style, as will be seen, is that of a continuous narrative, apparently compiled from a diary, and as it proceeds, marking the lapse of time, the original dryness of manner gives place to one more animated, more in keeping with the temperament of the writer. When I had buried my dear wife, I waited with some impatience to see what the police would do. I had no great expectations. The English police system is more adjusted to offences against property than to those against the person. Nothing had been stolen, so nothing could be traced, and the clues were certainly very slight. It soon became evident to me that the authorities had given the case up. They gave me no hope that the murderer would ever be identified, and in fact it was pretty obvious that they had written the case off as hopeless and ceased to interest themselves in it. Of course I could not accept this view. My wife had been murdered. The murder was without extenuation. It had been committed lightly to cover a paltry theft. Now, for murder, no restitution is possible, but there is an appropriate forfeit to be paid, and if the authorities failed to exact it, then the duty of exaction devolved upon me. Moreover, a person who thus lightly commits a murder as an incident in his calling is unfit to live in a community of human beings. It was clearly my duty as a good citizen to see that this dangerous person was eliminated. This was well enough in theory, but its realization in practice presented considerable difficulties. The police had, presumably, searched for this person and failed to find him. How was I, untrained in methods of detection, to succeed where the experts had been baffled? I considered my resources. They consisted of a silver teapot and a salver which had been handled by the murderer and which, together, yielded a complete set of fingerprints, and the wisp of hair that I had taken from the hand of my murdered wife. It is true that the police also had finger-marked plate and the remainder of the hair, and had been unable to achieve anything by their means, but the value of the finger impressions for the purpose of identification is not yet appreciated outside scientific circles. Beginning of footnote. Footnote 1. The narrative seems to have been written 1890. L.W. End of footnote. I fetched the teapot and salver from the drawer in which I had secured them and examined them afresh. The teapot had been held in both hands and bore a full set of prints, and these were supplemented by the salver. For greater security I photographed the whole set of the fingerprint impressions and made platinotype prints which I filed for future reference. Then I turned my attention to the hair. I had already noticed that it was of a dull grey colour, But now, when I came to look at it more closely, I found the color so peculiar that I took it to the window and examined it with a lens. The result was a most startling discovery. It was ringed hair. The grey appearance was due, not to the usual mingling of white and dark hairs, but to the fact that each separate hair was marked by alternate rings of black and white. Now, variegated hairs are common enough in the lower animals which have a pattern on the fur. The tabby cat furnishes a familiar example. But in man the condition is infinitely rare, whence it was obvious that, with these hairs and finger-prints, I had the means of infallible identification. But identification involves possession of the person to be identified. There was the difficulty. How was it to be overcome? Criminals are vermin. They have the typical characteristics of vermin: unproductive activity combined with disproportionate destructiveness. Just as a rat will gnaw his way through a Holbein panel, or shred up the Vatican Codex to make a nest, so the professional criminal will melt down a priceless medieval plate to sell in lumps for a few shillings. The analogy is perfect. Now, how do we deal with vermin? With the rat, for instance. Do we go down to his burrow and reason with him? Do we strive to elevate his moral outlook? Not at all. We induce him to come out, and when he has come out we see to it that he doesn't go back. In short, we set a trap. And if the rat that we catch is not the one that we wanted, we set it again. Precisely. That was the method. My housemaid had absconded at the time of the murder. She was evidently an accomplice of the murderer. My cook had left on the same day, having conceived a not unnatural horror of the house. Since then I had made shift with a charwoman, but I should want a housemaid and cook, and if I acted judiciously in the matter of references, I might get the sort of persons who would help my plans, for there are female rats as well as male. But there were certain preliminary measures to be taken. My physical condition had to be attended to. As a young man I was a first-class athlete, and even now I was strong and exceedingly active, but I must go into training and brush up my wrestling and boxing. Then I must fit up some burglar alarms, lay in a few necessaries, and provide myself with a suitable appliance for dealing with the "catch." This I later proceeded with at once. To the end of a rod of rhinoceros horn about 2 feet long, I affixed a knob of lead weighing 2 pounds. I covered the knob with a thickish layer of plaited horsehair, and over this fastened a covering of stout leather, and when I had fitted it with a wrist strap it looked a really serviceable tool. Its purpose is obvious. It was an improved form of that very crude appliance, the sandbag, which footpads use to produce concussion of the brain without fracturing the skull. I may describe it as a concussor. The preliminary measures were proceeding steadily. I had put in a fortnight attendance at a gymnasium under the supervision of Professor Schneip, the Bavarian Hercules. I had practiced the most approved knockouts known to my instructor, the famous pugilist Melchizedek Cohen, popularly known as Slimy Cohen. I had given up an hour a day to studying the management of a concussor with the aid of a punching ball. The alarms were ready for fixing, and I even had the address of an undoubtedly disreputable housemaid, when a most unexpected thing happened. I got a premature bite. A fellow actually walked into the trap without troubling me to set it. It befell thus. I had gone to bed rather early and fallen asleep at once, but about 1 o'clock I awoke with that unmistakable completeness that heralds a sleepless night. I lit my candle lamp and looked around for the book that I had been reading in the evening, and then I remembered that I had left it in the museum. Now that book had interested me deeply. It contained the only lucid description that I had met with of the Mandurucu Indians and their curious method of preserving the severed heads of their enemies, a method by which the head, after removal of the bones, was shrunk until it was no larger than a man's fist. I got up, and taking my lamp and keys, made my way to the museum wing of the house, which opened out of the dining room. I found the book, but, instead of returning immediately, lingered in the museum, looking about the great room and the unfinished collection, and gloomily recalling its associations. The museum was a gift from my wife. She had built it and the big laboratory soon after we were married, and many a delightful hour we had spent in it together, arranging the new specimens in the cases. I did not allow her to work in the evil-smelling laboratory, but she had a collection of her own, of land and freshwater shells, which were cleaner to handle than the bones. And I was pulling out some of the drawers in her cabinet, and, as I looked over the shells, thinking of the happy days when we rambled by the riverside or over furzy commons in search of them, when I became aware of faint sounds of movement from the direction of the dining room. I stepped lightly down the corridor that led to the dining room and listened. The door of communication was shut, but through it I could distinctly hear someone moving about, and could occasionally detect the chink of metal. I ran back to the museum. My felt-soled bedroom slippers made no sound, and, taking the concussor from the drawer in which I had concealed it, thrust it through the waistband of my pajamas. Then I crept back to the door. The sounds had now ceased. I inferred that the burglar, for he could be none other, had gone to the pantry, where the plate chest was kept. On this I turned the Yale latch and softly opened the door. It is my habit to keep all locks and hinges thoroughly oiled, and consequently the door opened without a sound. There was no one in the dining room, but one burner of the gas was alight and various articles of silver plate were laid on the table, just as they had been when my wife was murdered. I drew the museum door to. I could not shut it because of the noise the spring latch would have made, and slipped behind a Japanese screen that stood near the dining room door. I had just taken my place when a stealthy footstep approached along the hall. It entered the room, and then there was a faint clink of metal. I peeped cautiously round the screen and looked on the back of a man who was standing by the table on which he was noiselessly depositing a number of spoons and forks and a candlestick. Although his back was towards me, a mirror on the opposite wall gave me a good view of his face, a wooden and expressionless face, such as I have since learned to associate with the English habitual criminal, the penal servitude face, in fact. He was a careful operator. He turned over each piece thoroughly, weighing it in his hand and giving especial attention to the hallmark, and, as I watched him, the thought came to my mind that perchance this was the very wretch who had murdered my wife, come back for the spoil that he had then had to abandon. It was quite possible, even likely, and at the thought I felt my cheeks flush and a strange, fierce pleasure, such as I have never felt before, swept into my consciousness. I could have laughed aloud, but I did not. Also, I could have knocked him down with perfect ease as he stood, but I did not. Why did I not? Was it a vague, sporting sense of fairness, or was it a cat-like instinct impelling me to play with my quarry? I cannot say, only I know that the idea of dealing him a blow from behind did not attract me. Presently he shuffled away, in list slippers, to fetch a fresh cargo. Then some ferociously playful impulse led me to steal out of my hiding-place and gather up a number of spoons and forks, a salt-cellar, a candlestick, and an entrée dish, and retire again behind the screen. Then my friend returned with a fresh consignment, and, as he was anxiously looking over the fresh pieces, I crept silently out at the other end of the screen, out of the open doorway and down the hall to the pantry. Here a lighted candle showed the plate chest open and half empty, with a few pieces of plate on a side table. Quickly, but silently, I replaced in the chest the spoons and other pieces that I had collected, and then stole back to my place behind the screen and resumed my observations. Chapter 2